By 2 p.m., the last remaining fighting in the entire Houston battle was occurring within its downtown area in a very tiny, ever-compressed area as the People's Armed Police had sent in originally a single battalion that had cleared the outermost flanks in the northwest of the city's core metro area before racing down State Highway 249 and beginning to capture many of the key buildings in the downtown area that would be utilized by the CCP regime during the colonization efforts after the military victory had been secured, as the People's Armed Police were also tasked with crushing the armed reactionary civilian elements as well as the American paramilitary forces and any military straggling members or forces that had made their way into the downtown area from other parts of the battlefield, which there had been a very tiny number of them mixed in as well. As the PLA forces, having had freshly cleared from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, the HHT, as they had gradually cleared the flanks for their coming operation against them, as everything fell apart, the logistics that had been originally meant for the combat forces from this forward logistical point, as in the different squadrons of 278th ECR, like the 2nd, the 1st, as well as also the 1st and 98th Cav with the 1st Squadron of 278th ACR, one of the out-of-state elements from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, as well as also forces from the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, like the 2nd of the 156th, as well as the other forces of the 278th ACR, like the Regimental Engineering Battalion and 3rd Squadron, as 4th Squadron was an aviation squadron and had been destroyed with other aviation forces at the Joint Base Ellington, the nucleus or nerve center of the city's defenses, and the command thereof, as well as a main logistical hub that would distribute logistics to the forward logistical points managed by the HHT and support squadron that would be further distributed to the other combat forces in the area, like the 2nd of the 156th Regimental Engineers, as well as also to the 1st Squadron and the 1st of the 98th Cav, as well as the 2nd Squadron and the 2 artillery battalions present, as in the Fire Squadron, and also the 2nd of the 114th, another out-of-state element coming also from the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, and of course, the 3rd Squadron as well. As all of these forces had since been destroyed leading up to this point in time, the air power of the PLAAF and Russian VVS, or Russian Air Force, had essentially returned to conduct strike sorties as their purpose as fighters in attaining air superiority had already been achieved, as the USAF had been destroyed on the ground all throughout the nation, and now these fighter aircraft could serve in a complete close air support capacity now that the USAF had been destroyed, and return armed with air-to-ground munitions. As the heavy strategic bombers, the Tu-22Ms, would take much longer to prepare for their missions, as these were larger aircraft and required ever more fuel and maintenance activities, as well as the loading of the munitions, which all took more time than it took to prepare the fighters and strike aircraft, such as ground attack planes. The last remaining Tu-22M that had not dropped its munitions yet would get its mission to fly to the immediate southwest of the core metro area and hit the city of Richmond in preparation for the 1st Marine Brigade, as symbolized by this unit icon with an anchor, as they would conduct their broad sweep like a sickle cut south of the core metro area all the way to Richmond before getting on I-69 and going into the city as the final move in the operation, as their last major combat would actually not occur in Richmond but would occur in Alvin, as the heavy strategic bomber of the Tu-22M on its way back to base would drop its munitions on Richmond, which would end up scattering any would-be resistors either out of the city to the west or towards Alvin, which many would end up going, as Alvin would end up having ultimately several thousand defenders, including the remnants, the very tiny remnants of the naval security personnel and Coast Guard forces, in addition to the tiny amount of gun crews left and their howitzers from the 1st of the 141st, which also came like the 2nd of the 156th from the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team that had also been carpet munitioned by a Tu-22M strike utilized in a tactical capacity similar to what happened to two full battalion-sized elements of the 1st Squadron and the 1st of the 98th Cav as they attempted to push away or possibly try to destroy PLA forces that had materialized as Trojans very dangerously close to their forward logistics of the HHT, as well as the other threats present. However, they were unable to challenge these coalition forces and were destroyed in rapid succession by the total drone superiority as in ISR, as well as their kamikaze loitering munition drones, and also their total superiority in air power, weapons technologies, and the size of their forces had essentially shredded the American defenders to pieces in a very rapid succession yet again. As by now, the forces of the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, including a mechanized infantry battalion of it, as well as both of its armored battalions, having destroyed the artillery forces of the Americans in the Sugar Land area, had moved into the western downtown area of Houston, as well as the mechanized infantry battalion, having recently destroyed the HHT remnants, as well as overran their supplies, were moving north after having consolidated themselves and refilled with their own logistical preparations before moving north into downtown itself, with a single mechanized infantry battalion from the 58th Combined Arms Brigade having destroyed the forces in the Galena Park supply depot area as they had established a forward supply point with their support battalion. After having had overrun them, they had conducted a logistical resupply and pause, preparing for their strike into downtown as well. And now, some of their subordinate companies that comprised this battalion were not only surrounding a relatively large group of armed reactionary civilian resistors, but also sending a company to capture a power plant in the downtown area, as well as also a single company to cut off any overland escape from the downtown to the south, as well as also the other battalion moving up of mechanized infantry coming from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade moving in the area, linking up with them, as by now there were different pockets in the downtown area having been completely surrounded and cut off overland, with the only way to escape being the below ground routes in the city's massive labyrinth of underground sewers, drainage, and maintenance tunnels and basements, as the above land routes were completely cut off and increasingly dangerous due to the ISR dominance of the coalition forces able to see anything and everything that was above ground, including all the way at the squad and vehicle crew level, all the way up to high altitude drones, even higher than that, to satellite, as this provided them an overlay from the very highest level view all the way to the lowest of the ever-changing fluid modern battlefield, updated by the literal second, as it only took milliseconds for the artificial intelligence program to calculate multiple dynamics of information types and sort them out and advise the forces on how best to use their forces and do so in a safe manner that prevented any type of friendly fire incidents between the coalition forces, including between the foreign forces working together in concert, whether that was the Russians and Chinese or the other members of the coalition working together, as the artificial intelligence could translate and do everything for these forces insofar as their updates and coordinating their actions. As the People's Armed Police had originally sent in a single battalion early on in the fighting to capture critical buildings in the downtown area, which they managed to do with a high degree of success, Two additional battalions that had cleared the flanks to the immediate north of 249, the state highway, had by now moved in to reinforce the battalion that had earlier gone in of their brigade of the 36th PAP, with other PAP battalions of the brigade moving in to the outer ring road to essentially act as a reserve force as well as provide assistance to the PLA's 83rd Artillery Brigade battalions operating in the area, if need be, as a mobile mechanized light infantry type of force, as these paramilitary troops had a high degree of mobility in their very effective and nimble, fast, and potent vehicles consisting of their WZ-551s, including the IFV version with the 25mm autocannon and 7.62x54mm coax, which turret on a remote-controlled turret by the gunner inside, as well as the APC version with a heavy machine gun turret for a W-85 12.7mm heavy machine gun. As the People's Armed Police also wielded anti-tank capabilities at the man-portable level with their HJ-08s, they had their Type 74 flamethrowers, as the incendiary weapons were particularly terrifying to enemies and destructive against human flesh. They also had a high degree of support from loitering munitions, including when set on AI target-seeking mode, which was influenced by the ISR capabilities finding enemies and processed through the AI, which assisted in targeting these kamikaze drones, these CH-901A loitering munitions, into targets to directly support the troops on the ground in the most efficient of ways. As now, these forces were moving against the remaining several thousand defenders in downtown, including others that had fled into the downtown area to escape the massive artillery concentrated barrages throughout much of the city. They were now herded into an ever smaller area as the People's Armed Police and even PLA forces moved in from all sides, closing in on them. And by 2 p.m., the fighting would only last 2 more hours in the core metro area before the entire above ground of the city had been completely and thoroughly cleared of any and all resistance at the armed reactionary level, including also, of course, the military level in terms of the American armed forces components that were in the area. As now the fighter aircraft of the PLAAF and VVS, or the Russian Air Force, would end up flying 3 different combat sorties, while the heavy strategic bomber aircraft would only end up flying 1, which would be essentially enough anyhow, as the fighting was coming to an end. The bombers would be ready for their next mission, but would end up not having to fly it due to the fact that the fighting in Houston had been over by that point, at which point the bomber squadron would be diverted to hit other targets elsewhere, although the fighters would remain and be used as a close air support / strike aircraft capacity, as the American Air Force by this point in time had long since been destroyed within the first 5 or so hours. As the forces moving up the state highways to get to Interstate 10, as in the external prong of group armies 15 through 20 were now arriving into the area by this point after having had concluded and were victorious in their battle at the border in the lower Rio Grande battle / McAllen battle. They were now moving into the area and getting ever closer, about to get on I-10 and take it all the way into the American Southeast to reinforce the Trojans that were already there doing much of the heavy lifting, similar to other parts of the country. However, they would shed one of their group armies to support the actions of occupation in the Houston area, as in Group Army 15 would relieve the 83rd Group Army, allowing for the 83rd to do a brief rest and refit before moving north into northeast Texas, where they would establish their new AO along with People's Armed Police forces that were already there in a Trojan capacity, who would remain with them for the initial phases of occupation, as the 83rd would move into that area, as their air assault battalion was already attached to the group army responsible for the fighting in Dallas-Fort Worth. As that battle as well required a large number of forces, they would rendezvous with the air assault brigade of their group army of the 83rd after the military victory over the country had been secured, as in the South Central Invasion Sector and even the rest of the country beyond. And then the Air Assault Battalion would rejoin the 83rd in its new AO. As the fighting in downtown was occurring in an ever-shrinking area, this particular area was only a 1 kilometer by 500 meter area, as immediately south was a PLA Mechanized Infantry Company from the Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 58th Combined Arms Brigade that had moved into the area and sent one of its Mechanized Infantry companies to capture the power plant, and another immediately south of the area where the fighting was going on, which was in a very tiny part of downtown where Interstate 45 curved around, as these forces had long since been compressed as the People's Armed Police were savagely brutal and crushing all of the armed resistance in the area and were committing many battlefield atrocities as well to make examples of the resistors, as they specialized in crushing these very types of forces in counterinsurgency, but could also go toe-to-toe with military units of foreign nations as they were equipped to do so. As this was the Praetorian Guard of the CCP regime, an elite shock force that was the very cream of the crop of all their paramilitary forces. As the PLA was the military forces of the nation, the PAP was like a whole different separate army, as China had two armies effectively. They had a paramilitary force of multiple branches, and they had their military of different branches, and they worked together in this invasion to a high degree of efficiency. As the loitering munitions support in this area had been fired by the dedicated combat drone sections of the headquarters battalion of the 36th PAP Brigade, as well as also the dedicated drone sections of the PLA headquarters battalions of the different brigades in the area to support their forces, and the PAP as well, artillery from the PLA would also support PAP actions in this area, as from one of the three attacking PAP battalions would come two different companies operating in this very small area. One company moving in from the northeast, and another moving in from the north and slightly west. As they were coming into this area, again, the PLA was just off map and to the south, and the Americans had become bottled into an increasingly smaller area, as the original battalion that struck downtown had already been doing an enormous amount of fighting just to the immediate northeast before now sending in their last attack to seize the remainder of American-held areas, including the City Hall. The aquarium had just been captured immediately off the map, and now these forces were moving into an area where their TV station would be captured, as there were multiple TV stations throughout the city, and there was one even in this downtown area, and these were important to the occupation afterwards. And this TV station had just been freshly captured, as this platoon had sent in two of its squads to hold the TV station, while its three additional squads had been dismounted into this area on the adjacent street and were led by a squad in a wedge formation with two behind it in line formations on either side of the street, moving gradually into the area, with this platoon moving in as well, and this platoon of vehicles of 5 coming from under I-45 here, as it was very dangerous for the Americans to expose themselves on high ground, whether that was on the highway overpasses, on the stilting here, like I-45 moving through the area, or whether that was on top of the parking garage or City Hall building that were wanted intact, as the City Hall was very important as well, as the civic buildings had already been falling bit by bit to the People's Armed Police, as they had originally sent in their one battalion initially to begin to seize these buildings. Many of the high-rises in the city had already been essentially, for all intents and purposes, shelled into oblivion by the 300mm rocket strikes, 155mm concentrated shellings, But even the concentrated fire was ISR directed to avoid destroying highway infrastructure or other important buildings like the City Hall. This was Sam Houston Park, and part of it had been dug up and turned into small trench-like systems that were being defended by reactionary civilians and paramilitary forces and any remaining military stragglers that had fled into the downtown area. As the forces had fled into downtown, they had taken everything with them that they could carry from the logistical forward depot that was controlled by the HHT, originally meant for the combat forces of the American Army. As things fell apart and deteriorated, veterans of the military that were familiar with some of the systems like the AT-4s had taken some of them and moved into downtown as the PLA troops had approached, and also cans and more cans of ammunition, whatever they could carry, and would utilize this in the final fighting going on in downtown, as well as also Molotovs had been put together in limited numbers and would be used to mild effectiveness in this area as well, as one PAP company would lose 2 vehicles, this platoon already having had lost one to Molotovs, as although the PAP and PLA had total domination in terms of ISR and could see everything happening above ground, there were still times when the Americans could use the manhole covers and rubble to mild effectiveness with pinprick attacks that would destroy or damage a vehicle or troops here and there as the fighting had become more savage. However, when they would expose themselves, even for a short moment, they would also expose themselves to vicious counterattacks and be destroyed as a result. So in a sense, when they would attack PAP vehicles and troops, it would be a kamikaze attack because they would end up losing their lives in the process. As this M113 here, this M113 here, and M113 here were essentially paramilitary vehicles given down to paramilitary entities through government programs, as well as this MRAP and this MRAP as well. They essentially were the SWAT vehicles that had light machine guns on them mounted, which could do little to nothing to the PAP vehicles themselves, but could be a menace to their ground troops. However, their ground troops had rocket-propelled grenades of the Type 69 varieties, as well as HJ-08 anti-tank missile systems, which were devastating against those vehicles and would easily destroy them. Even the 25mm autocannon was quite powerful and would decimate an MRAP or an armor personnel carrier with ease. Even a Bradley could be destroyed by the armor-piercing ammunition of the WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicles' 25mm autocannon, and some vehicles had been upgunned to a 30mm autocannon, which was even more destructive, but these vehicles were still equipped with the 25 on their IFVs. And as the armor personnel carrier versions had heavy machine gun turrets with the 12.7mm heavy machine guns, those could wreak havoc as well against certain building materials, as well as also personnel, even with body armor, as well as also vehicles of certain types, and were a menace, especially to softer skinned vehicles and even light armored vehicles like the M113, which could be shredded to pieces by a 12.7mm heavy machine gun, as their armor was an aluminum alloy armor, and although it made the vehicle light and relatively mobile and easy to transport, it also made the vehicle vulnerable to certain types of weapons, including 12.7mm fire against its side and back, as well as also rocket-propelled grenades, regardless of where they hit on the vehicle. As the group armies were moving into the area, again, the 15th PLA Group Army would replace the 83rd. However, the 83rd was wrapping up the fighting alongside of the PAP's 36th Brigade in the area, as the armored forces in West Houston were smashing whatever little bit of resistance was left there. And although there were tiny instances where some PLA weapons fell into the hands of Americans, this was mostly due to these pinprick ambushes netting them a very small number of Type 69 RPGs or rifles carried by some of these troops, including those with 35mm tube-fired grenades beneath. But it was very little, and this would end up growing during the occupation as partisan groups would realize that they had to start small and begin to gather weapons that way that they could then turn around and use against supply convoys going between the FOBs that they could then get even better weapons from as time progressed. It was like a domino effect of sorts. But at the very beginning, the partisans would lose enormous numbers of theirs, and they would lose massive life in the struggle against the occupation forces, who had vastly superior weaponry, technology, ISR capabilities, and more. As these forces were devastating the city, which lay in ruins in most areas, including from the strategic air raids, the 300mm rocket strikes, and concentrated 155mm strikes from the PLZ-05 self-propelled howitzers that equipped the entire 83rd PLA Group Army's artillery elements, minus the A300 Battalion in the 83rd Artillery Brigade and the PHL-11 Battalion in that same brigade, with the howitzer forces all equipped with the 155 PLZ-05 within the 83rd. And the PHL-11s with their relatively potent 122mm rockets could blanket a large area as well with rocket fire, and had destroyed much of the American forces in the Channel View area with this concentrated rocket fire from the 122mm rockets, doing a time-on-target technique. As in this area, artillery fire would become more precise as instead of concentrated to aid the People's Armed Police attacks. They would result in the destruction of a relatively large number of armed reactionary civilian resistors in the area, with the loitering munitions contributing as well in a relatively sizable sum, as the People's Armed Police dismounts and vehicles would also destroy large numbers of resistors. As this platoon moved in, they had 3 dismounted squads and 2 that had yet to be dismounted, which would be dismounted as they moved towards the City Hall and the parking garage to clear the parking garage after the loitering munitions had done the job of clearing enemies from the roofs of all buildings in the area, including here as well, a loitering munition moving in to strike these personnel in this building, this surviving building here that would be cleared by dismounts, as the People's Armed Police 3 squads that were dismounted would end up breaking up to clear buildings and move through the area. As early on, there were many reactionary elements fleeing the area, trying to get to this manhole cover as well as into this building, although they would be pursued by PAP forces clearing the building. This was the Commerce Center, and it was already being cleared by PAP elements who were scaling the walls to the 2nd and 3rd floors with their grappling skills, as they would fire at windows and after taking the windows out, throw grenades in to clear the rooms, and then they would hurriedly climb up their rappelling ropes into these floors and would then proceed up and down as the squad going through the main entrance from this vehicle rolling up from this platoon of 5 vehicles, with 2 vehicles going this way to guard the outside of the building, as well as a squad coming from this vehicle moving in through the back, and this squad from this vehicle rappelling into the higher levels, grappling rather into the higher levels. The 2nd and 3rd floor would proceed up while the other squads would proceed down into the basement to clear the entire building, as this was a high-rise building in this area, and these buildings were high-rises as well, with some that had been completely destroyed just collapsing out and into the streets, similar to these types of occurrences in this area, as well as the artillery fire in this area. Although a Tu-22M had not carpet munitioned the area, the artillery fire was still so destructive that many buildings had been reduced to abject ruination. As this was the last Tu-22M flying over the area, getting its targeting information, it would hit the Richmond area and soften it up for the PLAN Marines, who were doing their sickle cut as they had now finished up in the Dickinson area and League City area that was immediately just off this map, right literally here. They would move to Alvin, that was right here, before proceeding on to Richmond and moving up I-69 into the core metro area, as the last major fighting would actually occur in Alvin outside of League City, as the PLAN Marines would conduct a brilliant campaign in that area to smash the concentrated resistors that would essentially muster into that particular area and prevent them from escaping to continue the fight in other parts of the metro area, and also preventing them from becoming partisans in the future by destroying this relatively sizable number of defenders in Alvin, as that would be the last combat operation of the entire battle in Houston, conducted by the PLAN Marines, while this would be the last major fighting in the core metro area, as the downtown was now being squeezed on all sides by PAP and PLA regular military units, regular army units. As in this area, in Sam Houston Park, this platoon was pressing a major attack into the area with their vehicle-based forces as well as 3 dismounted squads on their flanks of the vehicles. One squad moving and assaulting this rubble pile and engaging in a large firefight back and forth with these forces, firing rocket-propelled grenades, firing 35mm tube-fired grenades from beneath the barrels of the troops that had those, as well as also firing HJ-08 anti-tank missiles into the rubble, which were quite effective against rubble positions due to the penetration power against armor, also doubling against certain types of building material, rubble. As they also got closer to this rubble pile, they began using hand grenades and even stormed the pile and conducted hand-to-hand combat in some instances, all guided by ISR capabilities, as well as also were the loitering munition strikes against enemies on rooftops of the parking garage and the city hall. As the aquarium had just been cleared off map, the TV station was captured by 2 dismounted squads from this platoon, while the other 3 squads of the platoon had since moved through here and had KIA'd these American reactionary elements with their flamethrower, as indicated by this orange-colored arrow, as well as small arms fire, before proceeding down this street on the other side of these buildings from their vehicles. As their vehicle-based fires had already taken out these enemies in this rubble pile, these American forces, who had tried to fight back against the lead IFV, but were cut down from the vehicle right behind it, firing into the rubble pile. The different APCs with their heavy machine guns, their 12.7mm, while the lead vehicle also fired and destroyed these armed reactionary elements coming out of this building, and the enemies in this rubble pile were also likewise engaged, while this loitering munition with an HE warhead came down on top of this M113, this paramilitary vehicle, and destroyed it. As these vehicles had survived within the parking garage, not all that dissimilar from the battle that occurred in Waco, how the parking garages had been used, these paramilitary SWAT vehicles and elements had come out and tried to press a counterattack in this area into the Sam Houston Park to assist these reactionary civilians that were trying to put up a fight here, who were being barbecued alive by the flamethrowers of these 2 dismounted squads as they lined up and formed an L-like formation and vectored their fire along with their vehicle-based fires coming into the area as well. As the vectoring of fire, as they got into line formations, along with vehicle-based fire, had completely made this area a miniature kill box, along with a few loitering munition strikes. These paramilitary elements, as they rounded the corner between these gutted buildings and rubble pile right here, as these forces had been destroyed at the opening of the map by the vehicle-based fire that were in this rubble pile here, the vehicles then vectored their fire into this area. The lead IFV and the APCs following behind it, as well as the troops forming into their line formations, had cut all these forces down and were trying to take cover in different positions they had dug in Sam Houston Park, as this was only a small part of the park on this side of I-45, and the park continued beyond. As these vehicles are moving through the park itself and clearing it, while on their flanks this squad cleared this former building that was a rubble pile, while precision artillery strikes struck here that were ISR directed to destroy a grouping of armed reactionary civilians and technicals that were in this area, as well as this MRAP right here. This MRAP was destroyed by the artillery strikes into the area that were ISR directed to mitigate any potential damage to the highway and were precision oriented. As they were ISR directed, they were extremely precise and did no damage to the critical infrastructure that the PAP and PLA wanted to capture intact. This strike right here on this former building had blasted rubble in multiple directions and KIA'd a large grouping of enemy forces as these vehicles were at this point right here and beginning to move in to surround the City Hall. As by this point, the fighting in Sam Houston Park had completely wrapped up. The counterattack, the local counterattack in this particular area had been defeated brutally by the vehicles and anti-tank based weapons from these infantry forces, who then formed up and began to strike into the City Hall. They entered the building while their vehicles then moved around to the side of it as per SOP, while these vehicles of the other platoon were moving up as well, engaging enemy forces that were in these rubble piles, as this grouping of vehicles had already eliminated these forces with the assistance of a single loitering munitions strike into this rubble pile as well with an HE warhead, and the lead vehicle, the IFV, destroyed this APC, this M113 of the American paramilitary forces trying to hold this area between these former buildings, these rubble piles in this alleyway, and they were destroyed as a result. While that happened, this firefight had occurred in this area, including with these two groupings of armed reactionary civilians mixed with paramilitary forces trying to peel around the corner to cover the escape of these forces on this side, all as these vehicles had already engaged these forces over here and destroyed them in this rubble pile, and now we're beginning to proceed into the area and dismounting two squads to hold these former buildings that were complete rubble piles and recapture these positions from the Americans, essentially, capture them rather, and take them over. As this was going on here, as this fighting was going on, as again, there's a lot of things going on this map at the very beginning, and showing them in order is difficult, but it's being attempted. As the Americans came out this very, very short distance in this alley between these two former buildings, coming out of this manhole cover, they emerged and Molotov this vehicle as they had their weapons staggered to give them 360-degree security. They had their quadcopter assets circling the area. They saw them emerging, but they emerged so quickly due to the extremely short distance. By the time they returned fire and KIA'd all these Americans that came out of the sewer, they had already drenched this WZ-551 in Molotov cocktails. And the crew, though the crew escaped alive, including even the troops, they had come out of the vehicle after they had wiped out these American attackers. The Americans had this vehicle completely on fire, and the crew was ordered then to hold this position here as they came this way and watch this manhole cover because of the operations going on to capture this building and the proximity of this manhole cover to the operations going on over here against these Americans here. As in the opening, these forces were all fleeing into this building. These squads were already firing down the street at them. This lead squad in a wedge formation was not only firing at enemies in different directions, but they were firing ahead of them as well. And by the time they got here, they used their flamethrower on these enemies that emerged from this building, and they were also firing at these forces here as they had two squads behind them in line formations watching this area, and they tried to fire back. There was a short exchange of fire, but as they lost a few men in this area, these men escaped across the street into this area looking for a manhole cover, and while they did that, they turned around and held the corner as these vehicles were proceeding, which began to light them up, and they had lost some men, but while they got across, they reformed and left the area and found a manhole cover. Out of these 12 total troops right here, or these 12 total armed reactionary civilian personnel, only 4 of them survived to get out of this area and get to a manhole cover from these vehicle fires vectored into this area, as well as the troops in a firefight on this side moving into the area. They escaped, and only 4 survived. At the very opening of the map down here, some of these armed reactionary civilians between this still intact building and this former rubble pile building that used to be a high-rise were fleeing the area and were being fired at by the vehicle-based fire from down the street. And as they fled the area, they had lost some of their number as well, as there were about 15 of them fleeing the area, and they had lost about 8 of their number, with 7 of them surviving to get into this rubble pile. And then as they were spotted by the ISR assets fleeing the area through the rubble, artillery fire was called in on this position, as indicated by the imminent strike markers, these circles and X's. And 3 155 shells were vectored into the area and wiped out several more of them, but because they had already made it largely out of the rubble pile, because they were running as fast as their legs could carry them. By the time the artillery struck, it only got a few more of them again. It got 4 more of them, and the rest escaped to a manhole cover and entered the city's underworld, where many hundreds of thousands of people were taking refuge, as the underneath the city was highly crowded by this point, and the few remaining survivors from above ground were trying to get below ground, but some went into this building right here. As this building was connected, essentially it was a building that went in this type of shape, and it was connected by a small, narrow segment, that in this little space between these buildings, this little sidewalk area where these entrances to the building had 3 entrances in this side of it, and there were 2 entrances on each side of it here, and entrances on the other side where the sidewalk was. This was like a multi-office building that could be rented out to different types of like dental offices and other stuff like that. So it was like one of those multi-office buildings that had space for rent. So it had multiple entrances into it, and they were using these entrances to get into it, as well as go into the sewer right here for some of them. And they had already lost some early on at the opening of the map. As they were running, they had lost 3 of their number to the fire coming from down the street. And as some of them went in the building on this side, they were being engaged as well and lost a few more, as indicated by the red on this side of the arrow. They were being engaged. They had lost a few more going in the building, and by which point they had peeled around and engaged in a firefight as they came around the corner, because they were trying to escape from this company, as this was a full company. This was one squad that had cleared this building from this platoon and was already firing at and cutting these personnel down at the opening of the map. As the map opens up, there was a brief firefight as these men were trying to run north to escape from the PLA troops that are literally off the map about a block away. They were cut down by the PAP as they emerged from the building, and now the PAP advanced after the vehicles cut these men down who escaped from this intact building from right here. This is a very detailed battle map with a lot going on, and a lot of it interlocks with one another. As this squad moved into the area in a wedge formation, they were engaging the personnel in between this gutted building and this intact building here in the wedge, and the other side of the wedge was engaging the forces between these buildings here. As these personnel were emerging from these buildings trying to get underneath the city, they were cut off and engaged by the PAP, who saw them with their ISR assets and knew where they were, while they didn't even know that they were being basically attacked by the time they left these buildings. But the ISR quadcopter asset of this squad scanned the area ahead, watched them all emerge, and thus they got the drop on these personnel. And the vehicles moving in assisted as well. They fired their IFV-based weaponry as well as their turret-based heavy machine guns on the follow-up 2 vehicles, as these 2 vehicles also that were assisting in the storming of the Commerce Center building. And this was a high-rise building that they went in through the 2nd and 3rd floor as well as in the 1st floor, as this vehicle rolled right up and deployed troops right in the front door, while this squad from this vehicle grappled onto the 2nd floor, and this squad would grapple onto the 3rd floor from the back of the building from this platoon here that had already lost a vehicle to a Molotov attack, and now this vehicle was burning and cooking off. But the squad and crew, the gunner and driver and the squad of dismounts, had made it to the other side of this rubble to watch this manhole cover, but also be far enough away as these other 2 vehicles moved around the burning vehicle to press this assault. This vehicle was on fire with ammo cooking off, but because the ammo wasn't pressurized and being fired through a barrel and was just in ammo cans inside of a metal hull, a steel hull of the vehicle, it was relatively safe for these troops as long as they were a decent distance away and they were taking cover in the rubble on this side of the street that ran between the Commerce Center and these former buildings. This was an alleyway, but they were on the other side of these buildings in the rubble watching this manhole cover with their quadcopters and with eyes on it, watching for anybody to emerge. And as this happened, they deployed their squads, 1 squad on this rubble pile and 1 here, while the vehicles watched ahead. Well, this action had already occurred here. This action had already occurred, and yes, they were being fired at from the vehicle from the IFV leading the way, but again, they had several of their members survive and get to a manhole cover, while the rest had all been KIA'd from the vehicle-based fire and the fire from the infantry-based, the dismount troops. And as these three squads moved up after defeating and destroying these forces, the lead IFE here of this platoon had destroyed this MRAP, and the MRAP was trying to give some covering fire to these forces, but this vehicle destroyed the MRAP on the other side of this former building rubble pile before moving up and deploying two squads itself from these vehicles, one into this rubble pile with a squad from this platoon, and one into this rubble pile after the vehicle-based fires coming from all these vehicles had destroyed these forces trying to engage them from this rubble pile, and this dismounted squad fired into them as well. And as the squad moved in from this platoon, from these three vehicles of the platoon with the others at the Commerce Center Plaza here, as they moved in, they dismounted this squad in a double column rolling shield on this side of the vehicle. They went from behind the vehicle and into this building to clear it, while this squad had finished wrapping up here and wiping out these personnel in between these buildings that they'd spotted with their quadcopter assets. After, again, they had emerged from the building and wiped these personnel out who were trying to flee from the PLA forces of the 58th Combined Arms Brigade's battalion in the area, as they had a company just immediately off the map and to the south of mechanized infantry forces operating in the area of the PLA, who were holding the area down and preventing escape overland, at least to the south, of the American forces being increasingly squeezed into this area by the People's Armed Police troops, as they had two companies of one of their three battalions in this area that had now finished off the heavy fighting that had occurred in the park, in Sam Houston Park, before moving by the City Hall and deploying their last two squads that were vehicle-based inside the vehicle still, as they only had three of the five squads dismounted to clear the flanks and assist in the fighting in the park before going into the building and before going into the City Hall. As these personnel on the roof, these defenders on the roof, had tried to partake in the fighting here, they had been quickly destroyed by a loitering munitions strike in this area, as well as the personnel on the roof of the parking garage, with these last two squads of the platoon here of vehicles that had not been dismounted yet going in to clear out the parking garage, while this platoon had moved into the area and dismounted three squads just outside the parking garage, while these two squads dismounted after this vehicle was destroyed by an HE warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munition. Vehicles had already cut these forces down, and also the 25mm autocannon on this vehicle had destroyed this M113 before they had engaged these forces. And these three squads then broke up into one squad going in here, by which point they had all either gone in the manhole cover or into the building. This squad was engaging enemies in the building, while these two squads, as per SOP, were not only outside of this building, but were also assisting this platoon, who's had two squads here and their vehicles rolling up here, in engaging these forces in this rubble pile, as they had already fled the area and were mostly cut down by artillery. The forces finished off the battle in this area by the two squads, after having completed with these two squads and the defeat of these forces, capturing this rubble pile and heated combat, even devolving into hand-to-hand combat in some areas, all guided by ISR as far as watching all the movement in this pile and how to respond to it. These four total squads, two from this platoon attacking from this side, and these two squads from this platoon of vehicles, which stopped here and were giving some fire that was well vectored into this area after destroying this M113, had overcome the forces in this rubble pile, as again these forces had escaped early on. This loitering munitions strike hit these forces on this building for these two squads to then move down the street and break into one squad each, one holding the outside of this building as per SOP, while the other one went in to clear it. There were PLA forces just a bit further to the south, a block away, as this artillery strike had KIA'd a fairly decent number of armed reactionary civilians, as had this, and it also assisted in the destruction of the MRAP, as our further artillery strikes had already hit this former building and wiped out even more from this group that tried to flee. These forces had essentially moved in and cleared much of this area, with fighting going on for the City Hall inside the building and inside the parking garage, as well as inside of this building And inside of this building, as a squad had peeled off to go in and clear this building, this massive office building, with this squad being deployed to clear these buildings here as they would go through methodically and clear them to make sure there were no hostiles in them. And this squad holding the outside as they did that, as they went in here and cleared this and this one, and then they would go over this one where they would have vehicle-based support. As these vehicles moved in and deployed squads to hold rubble piles, they would hold their positions, as by this point, this area had been thoroughly mopped up by these dismounts and vehicles moving into the area, holding this position here, with their squads moving through to clear the last remaining buildings in the area and rubble piles, as this pile was heavily shelled. And this area was heavily shelled here, but done in such a way to where it mitigated any risk to the highway infrastructure. And the last real fighting that occurred, as this former building here, this was a crater from the different sea-based missile strikes from the CJ-10 land attack cruise missiles from the Ren High class and YJ-18Bs from the Song class subs that hit this area that used to be the DoD building in downtown Houston. They hit this DoD building with cruise missile strikes, and that's why it was a smoking crater, and the buildings around it were destroyed from the missile strikes. And then artillery came in as well. The last bit of fighting was between these three squads holding the outside of this building with their vehicles, while the other two squads were deployed inside to clear this. While the two squads had gone in and cleared this building, the last two vehicle-based squads were deployed to clear the parking garage while the vehicles sat outside and these troops were outside. And they began an engagement with these Americans holding this rubble pile right here. As the vehicles had finished off this group over here on this side, as they rolled through the street outside of the buildings as per SOP, as this platoon did the same on this side and then rolled up here, their dismounted three squads engaged these Americans for this rubble pile, and there was a heated firefight which eventually ended as all these forces had been KIA'd by the vehicle-based firepower from the 25mm autocannon and the coax machine gun, as well as also even a loitering munitions strike with an HE warhead, and all the small arms and 35mm tube-fired grenades and rocket-propelled grenades, anti-personnel and anti-tank because they were in rubble, as well as HJ-08 missiles into this area. And it finished off all these forces as vehicles had early again finished off these forces on this side of the pile that used to be a building, and artillery had gotten many of them underneath this area and destroyed this MRAP while sparing the highway of I-45 that went through the area. Loitering munitions had gotten these personnel again at the beginning. They were trying to drop Molotovs on these forces and fire down on them, but it was too late because the loitering munitions hurriedly came in and finished them off, with others taking out those on the rooftops of the parking garage and buildings in the area, and even some that helped in destruction of American vehicles that were even left that had survived by being in the parking garage before this combat ensued, when they had hurriedly moved out to try to take up fighting positions throughout the city, but would be destroyed rapidly by vehicle-based fires as well as anti-tank-based weaponry and loitering munitions. As by now, these forces of this company had moved through this area methodically and now held this area, while this company had moved in and cleared Sam Houston Park, taken the City Hall and parking garage by this point, and there are other forces clearing this last remaining building. As PLA forces were not very far away off the map, this area was completely locked down, and the ISR assets continued patrolling it, watching for enemy activity in case any enemies wanted to emerge from underground and challenge them. But now this area was completely locked down by the People's Armed Police, with the PLA forces having had cleared their sectors as the armored forces had moved in and into West downtown, and the mechanized infantry had moved in to the south of the last battle in downtown, as well as in the eastern parts of downtown, and had been thoroughly clearing their sectors, as all that was really left was handled by the People's Armed Police shock forces that went through and brutally crushed these forces with their flamethrowers, with their rocket-propelled grenades, their small arms, and their vehicle-based fires, with heavy loitering munitions support, of course, and more. As this Tu-22M had already passed through the area by the opening of this map, It had now carpet munitioned Richmond to soften up the area for the PLAN Marines' sickle-cut blow to clear the outermost suburbs to the south of the core metro area, which would begin in earnest at 3 p.m., which would begin halfway through this last battle in downtown. As this ended at 4 p.m., the battle to the south for Alvin would begin at 3, again, an hour before this battle concluded. And their last sickle cut would essentially move through Alvin and clear it in several hours of fighting before they would move on to Richmond and find little to no resistance, not enough for there to be any battle, and then move into the main metro area, by which point the 83rd will have been relieved by the 15th Group Army being shed off into the area, allowing for them to do a large rest and refit period to be able to move north and take up their new AO in northeast Texas, southeast Oklahoma, southwest Arkansas, and northwest Louisiana, as that would be their new area of operations with People's Armed Police forces that were already there as Trojan shock units. The next battle is the Battle of Alvin. There are a few parts to that battle. Next video of the hypothetical invasion documentary series, this Houston Battle sub-series of the larger 4th Generation Warfare South Central Invasion Sector / Texas docu-series.